this one. I used to work for the pharmacy. I'm honouring profit UEA. I've got some IT businesses doing things like the choice of medication website, which you might be aware of. I'm also a trustee of Norwich Central North at 9, which is where I was last night. I always put declarations of interest up, just to show that when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry, I'm a bit of a tart. But can I point out I'm not a prostitute? And since this lot up here, I do get a bit of money from that, but I don't get anything from that, so I figure it all works out about even. So my cunning plan was to do a little bit about the brain, how the brain works, the reward system, which Dr. Pinto had mentioned earlier, how we use and abuse substances, and some resources and signposting, which is separate to the NRP one, which are more general. So that's my plan. Now, human brain, fantastically complex. 100 trillion synapse connections between brain cells, or 100 million neurons, 100 billion neurons. So incredibly complex thing, which whenever I look at it, I always think, so where does boxing come from? It doesn't seem right to me. Processes 400 billion points of data every second. And it functions 24 hours a day. From the day you were born, only stops when you have an exam or fall. Sure, we all know that. Now, the brain is the most important organ that we've got. That's, well, according to the brain anyway. So anyway, within that brain, as we said, 10,000 million brain cells, or even more than that, perhaps. This is what just this sort of basic sort of reminder bit. We've got these brain cells. There's a nucleus in the middle. The cell body itself has got fibres and filaments. You've got a lot of these impulses coming in, messages coming into the centre of the brain. And then usually there's one big axon nerve fibre, which then goes off somewhere else and then spreads out and passes messages around. You've got astrocytes and microglial cells, which are the support network. Now, in terms of how much we know about brain cells and how they work, if we've got to 1 out of 100, we're probably doing quite well. We know the basic structure of it. We know what the cells look like. We're getting to know more about it, but what makes it tick and how it ticks is really sort of, I suppose we may never know, but it's some way off yet. Just to, that's a brain, a scan of a brain. The blue dots are the synapses, and these green fibres are the nerve fibres, and the collections there, that's the actual brain cells themselves. And that's a picture actually of a brain cell itself, just to show where the axons of the brain, the fibres are coming in, the synapse is there. So incredibly complex. But the one thing we do know about brains is these synapses, which is the junctions between one brain cell and the next brain cell. And this is just a diagrammatic way of looking at it. So you've got a brain cell over there, another brain cell over there, that one over there has a nerve fibre, it's got swelling in the end of it, it's got vesicles in the middle there which contain a chemical transmitter. There's a gap between the two. There are receptors on the other side, on the next brain cell, and how the brain cell over there sends a message to the one over there is that it sends an electrical message which comes along a bit like a Mexican wave. It's an electrical Mexican wave. That wasn't me getting muddled. It sort of flows down about 100 feet per second in case, well, normally it's about that. I found out the other day that it's slower if it's pain. Because when you stub your toe, you get the sensation first, then the pain afterwards. Because the pain nerves are slower than the touch sensation. That's something I read the other day. And stubbed my toe and realised it was right. An electrical message wave comes down here, hits the end of the nerve. As it does that, these vesicles fuse with the end plate. The transmitter that's in there is released. It travels across that synaptic cleft or the gap, hits the receptor. It clicks into that receptor a bit like a Yale key goes into a Yale lock. The receptor then changes shape. There are several different mechanisms by which that happens, but the net result is it triggers off another message electrical wave that starts there, and then that goes off. The transmitter that's in there is taken back up again into the nerve ending, then it resets itself, and then back on. It takes about a thousandth of a second, all of that. Now, what's that got to do with anything? Well, those transmitters that are in there are there are probably at least 200 different transmitters in the brain. They all have specific purposes. These receptors here only accept that transmitter there. So if that's dopamine, that'll be dopamine receptor. If it's serotonin, there'll be a serotonin receptor. If it's acetylcholine, it'll be an acetylcholine receptor. Now, within the brain, each of those receptors and transmitters has the same, they're in groups and they have specific effects, and they're not randomly spread around the whole brain. So dopamine, for instance, there are 4 separate areas, and one of the areas deals with muscles, and that's the bit that goes wrong in Parkinson's disease. Part of it deals with taking information in, processing it, deciding what's important. The reward area, which has already been mentioned, is in there as well. It involves dopamine. Another part regulates prolactin. And essentially, if you have too much or too little of any of these transmitters or the effect of them, it'll have an effect on your brain. So if you have too little dopamine in the system that affects your muscles, then your muscles tighten up, and that's the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. We've also got serotonin, which in the body is blood and guts essentially, but in the brain there's lots of little packages of serotonin. That there's a sleep-wake cycle, how hungry you feel, how satisfied you are with what you feel. It regulates mood, emotions, perhaps obsessive thoughts, goal-directed behaviour, perhaps obsessive behaviour, perhaps. So you can see that all of these have different effects in the brain. And I mentioned histamine. Histamine's job is to keep us awake. So those of you who've ever taken an antihistamine and feel sleepy, it's because the effects of histamine in the brain are being blocked, and that's what makes you sleepy. GABA is inhibitory in the brain, so that's the calm, that's the brake on the car, if you like, and glutamate is the accelerator. So let's go back to this again. Now you will see, just down there, the desired pathway. This is the transmitter in this area is dopamine. Dopamine is also in other areas of the brain, as we've just mentioned, but dopamine is what gives you the reward. So when you get a reward, it releases dopamine, and that's what gives you the reward and the high. So, just taking another step, what is an addictive substance? Now we've had this question about antidepressants or antipsychotics and so on. So there's too many people here to do this as a group exercise, but I do this as a group sometimes. Just ask people to name anything that you could become dependent on. And you usually get a list of alcohol, opiates, caffeine, nicotine. Oh, caffeine, yes, that's a good reminder. Cannabis, cocaine, you can put anything in there. I did this exercise in this group exercise in a forensic unit, and I got hitting people, something that was addictive. And every women's group I ever do, sex always comes up on that list as well.
Shoes.
Shoes, yes, shoes, chocolate, football, whatever. PPIs is not that thing that people phone you up about all the time, by the way. That's proton pump inhibitors. Those are one of the treatments, things like omeprazole and lansoprazole, pantoprazole, they're for stomach ulcers. And then I say, right, what are the important things? What makes something addictive? What makes a substance addictive? Now, there are sort of 4 main characteristics. This is based on the World Health Organization criteria, but sort of slightly adapted. First of all, you've got to have a craving, a desire for something, a want to take something. The second thing is you have to have withdrawal symptoms, which are specific for that particular compound. So obviously most people know withdrawal symptoms from alcohol, but you can get withdrawal symptoms from any number of things. Tolerance means that you need to take a higher dose to get the same effect. And we become tolerant to lots of things, noise, if you move, probably when Kevin found that when he moved to Norwich, the traffic was, from where it was Seapawling, wasn't it? You ran? Yeah. The traffic would have worked, but after a little while, your brain gets used to that. It knows it's not anything important, so you begin to tolerance. You begin to get tolerance to it. And then final thing is you've got to have a reward. It's a pretty obvious statement, but nobody ever abuses a substance they don't know they've taken. So you have to have a reward, and also that reward nearly always has to be within about an hour and a half. If not, you don't make the connection between taking something and the effect. And it's much more difficult to get the dose right. So if you've got craving, tolerance, withdrawal and reward, you can look at that lot and then you can say, right, alcohol, do you get craving? Yes. Do you get tolerance? Yes, you need a higher dose. Do you get withdrawal symptoms? Beginning of more symptoms. Do you get withdrawal symptoms, delirium, tremens, and do you get a reward? Yes, you do. And if you look at that lot, perhaps with cannabis, you probably do get withdrawal symptoms from higher doses, but lower doses tends to be not, because it's quite short acting. But you can see all the sort of classic substances produce craving, tolerance, withdrawal, and reward. And then one of the interesting things, you can look at some of the other ones there. And for instance, PPIs for stomach ulcers, if you stop taking them, you get a rebound production of acid, and actually for 5 or 6 weeks you can actually feel quite bad on those. So there is a withdrawal, so you can have antihypertensive drugs, you get the same type of thing. Antidepressants, there's no reward, but if you stop them suddenly you can get discontinuation withdrawal effects. So that's defined everything. So what do all these addictive substances have in common? Well, that's really what all of that lot have in common. Anyone want to guess what that is? Oh, it's Morse again. It's dopamine. It's the transmitter in the brain that's part of the reward system. There's loads of different cartoons and that, and that's just too many here, but technically, serotonin and dopamine are the only two things you enjoy. Low serotonin, if you've got low serotonin, that will produce a low mood. Most of the antidepressants increase the amount of serotonin in the brain. And dopamine is part of the reward system. Now, if we just look at this, which if you ever want to read anything around this area, the books by Stephen Stahl are highly readable. They're full of cartoons like this, as well as a plain text, and the two run side by side. So I recommend anything by Stephen Stahl. Also, the fact this is one of his slides, which he sent me, which is very good. But if you look at that lot, this is a dopamine nerve, and it's got all these impulses coming into it, and then it releases dopamine there, which goes to the reward center. And nearly all of those drugs have an effect on dopamine. So, for instance, if you take cannabis up there, cannabis stimulates cannabis receptors in the brain. Nobody knows what cannabis receptors are doing in the brain. Did we really evolve over the last 70 million years into humans, develop cannabis receptors just for somebody to discover that there was a plant that you could dry the leaves of and smoke and get cannabis from it? Nobody knows what it's doing there. But if you smoke cannabis, it stimulates cannabis receptors, which releases dopamine in the pleasure center. If you stimulate opiate receptors with opiate narcotics, then that will release dopamine in the pleasure centers. Nicotine will have an effect on acetylcholine, which will then release dopamine. Some hallucinogens will also have that effect. Alcohol has lots of effects in the brain, but one of which is to release dopamine. Cocaine and amphetamines, both of those release. Amphetamines either stimulate dopamine receptors or they displace dopamine from the end of the nerve ending. And cocaine can have a direct effect on it. So you can see nearly all of those have an effect via dopamine. So yes, technically dopamine is one of the few things that we actually really enjoy. So it's a stimulating of dopamine. And that's essentially what most of the substances of misuse and abuse are doing. They're increasing dopamine in the reward centres. You get a reward, you like it, so therefore you carry on from there, as was very eloquently put earlier. As I mentioned, there are 4 separate areas of dopamine in the brain. There's the extrapyramidal system, which is the one that controls movement and goes wrong in Parkinson's disease. You've got the meso something or other. Which one's that? Mesolimbic. That's the mesocortical, and that's the tuberomandibular system, which controls prolactin. And it's that one where the reward centre is based, with dopamine coming out of it. So dopamine's role in the brain is reward, motivation. When you fall in love with somebody, which was mentioned earlier, you get a huge rise in dopamine in the brain. Extraordinarily, you actually get a drop in serotonin, which you'd think you'd get high serotonin, wouldn't you, when you fall in love? But actually you don't. Your serotonin goes down, which then gives you the obsessive thoughts and intrusive thoughts. But in terms of the love part of it, you get a rise in dopamine, which then gives you goal-directed behaviour. So you want more of that dopamine, so you're going to try and get as much of it as possible. The rest of it looks after different areas of the brain, executive function. This is the bit that probably goes wrong in schizophrenia and psychosis. That's too active, so your brain starts making things up. And of course, you can increase your dopamine by lots of ways. You can take a substance which increases your dopamine. You can do exciting things, so risk-taking will increase dopamine levels. If you increase your opiates by running long distances, then that will increase your dopamine. So there's lots of rewards in there. Risk-taking and novelty are the things that really increase your dopamine levels. And that is risk-taking. There we go. Right. So you can see that most, not all of them, but most of the substances of dependence are dopamine-related drugs. And therefore, the effect that we try and use to try and calm down these effects are mostly related around dopamine receptors and transmitters. You saw that gap between the 2 nerves. If you take a chemical, you can take it into the body, gets into the brain, and then we'll get into that gap between the 2 nerves and we'll interfere with it. So if I take, for instance, some caffeine, that will get absorbed by my stomach into the body, get into the brain, and it antagonises the effect of adenosine. Adenosine is one of the transmitters that calms the brain down. So you stop the adenosine working, and therefore it stimulates you and brightens you up. So you can see from all most of those are dopamine related. You've got sedative drugs, which they mostly increase the amount of GABA within the brain. GABA is the calming, the brake on the brain. So alcohol will have several of the effects. And then we've got things like ecstasy, which probably works on serotonin receptors. And things like the legal highs, which are mostly legal because nobody knows what's in them. And you can't make an unknown, well, the government are trying to at the moment, you can't make an unknown chemical illegal unless you know what it is. So therefore they're mostly legal because nobody's worked out what it is to create a law to stop them being available. So for the opiates, the main aims with treating opiate dependence is to stabilise somebody, to reduce the harm from, for instance, injecting and similar risky behaviour, and then helping somebody stop opiates and then stay off them. And what most of the drugs try to do is to stimulate those opiate or dopamine receptors in the same way that heroin does. But if you take, for instance, heroin, you get a big high from it, and then it wears off. So you get a hit, but then you get withdrawal symptoms, you get a miss. And that's when you want to try and have some more to either get the hit, to get the high, or get rid of the withdrawal symptoms. So if you can replace short-acting heroin, for instance, with a longer acting drug that just gets onto the receptor, wanders onto the receptor and sits there for a day or so and then wanders off again. You don't get the high, but you also don't get the withdrawal symptoms. There are two major drugs that are used here, methadone and buprenorphine. There are some other drugs which have different effects. So naltrexone, for instance, blocks opiate receptors. So if you block the opiate receptor, you can take an opiate on top of it, but it doesn't have an effect. So that's going back to the Yale key and Yale lock idea. It's a bit like putting the wrong Yale key into a Yale lock, which we've all done, haven't we? I should think. Have you done that one time or another? Yeah. You get the key in, can't you? You can't get it out again, and it won't open the door. That's what things like naltrexone do with opiate receptors in the brain. It goes into the receptor, blocks it. It doesn't have an effect on it, so it doesn't stimulate it, but it also means if you have any opiates on top of it, then they can't affect the receptor because the receptor's already blocked. Now, methadone and buprenorphine have advantages and disadvantages, and I thought it might be useful just to go over some of the advantages and disadvantages. So methadone is a well-known green liquid. There are tablets and injection available. We prefer the liquid, tend to prefer that because it's difficult to inject. It's been around for a long time, it's well established. There's a lot of evidence for it. We know about it. It is sedating, which some people like. NHS trusts like it because it's cheap. And it stimulates the receptors directly. It's quite easy to supervise because once somebody's got it into their mouth, it's quite difficult to get rid of it then. The disadvantages of the advantage of the buprenorphine, it's much more difficult to use on top because what buprenorphine does is gets into the receptor, it stimulates it, partly stimulates it, but partly blocks it. So it has an effect, but then it stops you having anything else on top of it. So it's difficult to use any other drugs on top, which you can do with methadone. It is safe in overdose. It's quite difficult to take as an overdose. It's less stigmatizing because if you go, everyone's heard of methadone, but not everyone has heard of buprenorphine or Subutex. It's not sedating. You can't adulterate it. You can't cut it. You can't add stuff to it. And there is a product called Suboxone, which also contains naloxone. Now, naloxone stops the effect of buprenorphine. So I remember the first time I ever heard this, it was available in France for quite a long time before it came here. Why would you put something that blocks the effect of buprenorphine in a tablet with buprenorphine? Well, the answer is naloxone isn't absorbed if you take it by mouth. So if you take the tablet of Suboxone, you only get the buprenorphine from it. However, if you inject it, then you get the effect of Suboxone, the buprenorphine and the naloxone, and the naloxone stops the buprenorphine working and also puts you into rapid withdrawal. So it's a way of trying to stop people injecting, because you can, some people have tried amazing things with buprenorphine tablets. Their disadvantages are methadone is quite easy to overdose. You can use drugs on top of it. It gets onto the street, so it's available. It's quite stigmatizing. It's very high in sugar, so if you've got poor dental hygiene, then it does rot your teeth. It takes a long time to get off it, and it's it lasts about 24, 36 hours per dose, so you get quite a nice long sort of calm effect from it. It doesn't withdraw, but it doesn't really seem to have as much effect on craving, and not everyone likes the sedation. With buprenorphine, they're sublingual tablets, so you've got to put them underneath your tongue. The taste is particularly poor, which I did try a very small amount of one once, so I can guarantee the taste is particularly poor. So I don't work for the trust anymore, so I can get away with saying that. I had a policeman next to me as well. That's another story. It's more difficult to supervise because, semi-Subutex has been known to be available on the market. There's less experience of it. It can be injected. You can take the substance out from it. and you've only got that one tablet form. And if people like something sedating, then it's not particularly sedating if you wanted a sedation from it. So those are the two main ones. And the ideas of those is that you get rid of the high and you get rid of the withdrawal, and then you stabilise somebody, and then you can take them off it, or they can come off it at whatever time is considered politically appropriate at the time. With alcohol, again, one of the main requirements is harm minimisation, because alcohol will harm the person and also other people. There aren't that many road accidents caused by people smoking cannabis, but there are for alcohol. Coming off, so that then it's either coming off or reduction. And I think one of the things is that I think the purchasers haven't always got the hang of, is that they tend to think of, and certainly my colleagues within the purchasing side of the CCGs tend to think, well, if you're addicted to something or dependent on it, then stopping it is the only way. But actually, you can get a lot of harm reduction by reducing, because the harm from cigarettes does that. So even halving your dose of cigarettes doesn't actually make much difference. It's only when you get below sort of 5 or 10 per day does the risk really go down. Whereas with alcohol, the risk does that. So actually, if you can halve someone's intake, you can actually dramatically cut the risks from it. So the aims are coming off or reduction, whichever is appropriate. Not everybody can reduce. There are a number of techniques that are used. Disulfiram is an adversive treatment. Acamprosate reduces reward and craving, and naltrexone and nalmefene are reducing reward. I won't mention too much about detoxification. This is favourite Andy Cap. Best thing you can do is give up smoking, drinking and fried food if we're talking about drinking. And his reply to that, what's the second best? Which just about sums up a lot of people's attitude towards alcohol. So just going through these briefly. Disulfiram, when you metabolize alcohol, it's broken down by an enzyme into acetaldehyde, and then it's broken down to carbon dioxide and water. It stops the breakdown of acetaldehyde, and the equivalent of that is having vinegar injected into your veins. So it makes you very sick, flushing, sweating. I mean, it can, in rare cases, be fatal, but it's highly adversive. So if you drink, you begin to learn, if you drink alcohol, you get this reaction. It doesn't actually work quite as well as that, because people then just think, well, I won't take the abuse. I'll just drink instead, and certainly you can drink your way through it sometimes. So it's also often underdosed as well, so people don't get the correct dose. The Americans use 500 milligrams. In the UK, we use 200 milligrams. Illustrates it really. You can take it twice a week, and the tablets are dispersible in water. So there are ways of helping people to take disulfiram every day. Acamprosate, lovely clean drug, very few side effects. It probably helps about 1 in 10 people over a year. So it doesn't, it reduces reward and craving, and actually the occasional dose of alcohol doesn't stop it working. However, if you carry on taking alcohol, it will negate the effect of it. So not terribly effective, but it can be useful in some people, often in conjunction with some other drugs. Then you've got naltrexone and nalmefene, both of which block the opiate receptors, which reduce the reward from drinking. And most of the studies for this, alpha and for nalmefene, seem to imply that, yeah, you still try a drink, but you just don't, you try a drink and it's, just don't really fancy another one. So it seems to take that reward part of it away. Naltrexone is once a day. The one that the PCT were not very keen on at all was nalmefene. The idea of this being is it's a bit like naltrexone. It reduces the reward, but you can take it when required. So it will be a situation, well, I'm going out for the evening. Okay, well, you can do if you have your nalmefene. And you'd still try a drink, but you just don't really fancy the second or third one. So that's the idea. That's the idea of it. I think the CCGs had a problem with knowing when to stop and how you assess the effect. So it's not. I don't know what is the situation. Is it prescribable?
It's still no, not at the moment.
No, not really. No.
There's a big bump like that. Who's going to pay for it?
Yeah. Yes. Of course. Yeah. So of course the NNN pay for all the wards full of people with liver problems as a result of excess alcohol. My daughter working in Birmingham, she said you could close 2 wards if there was no alcohol in Birmingham. Just the people with with liver problems. I won't mention nicotine too much because it's running out of time. Other than you can either replace the nicotine and instead of getting a high, you get a nice steady effect, so you don't get the craving from it. And they're also varicline and bupropion, they reduce the craving and reward in some people. Benzos, people take those to a sedating effect or to come down off other drugs or just to sort of knock themselves out. I forget that one. It's an interesting picture, isn't it? Another thing, why did the body develop benzodiazepine receptors? Because that's a benzodiazepine receptor. It's a picture of a benzodiazepine receptor in the brain. That's what the receptor really looks like. It's a GABA receptor, and there's a binding site on there for benzodiazepines. So quite why the body evolved to wait for Hoffman and Laroche to discover diazepam, I have no idea. But they're there. It's a bit like cannabis receptors. So again, as with other substances, what we tend to do is I forget that. Yeah, but yeah. What the benzodiazepines do is they block GABA in to the receptor, jams it in there. Therefore, you get a greater sedating effect. So that's how they work. So what we tend to do with those is you can still buy them, benzos on the black market. You can either gradually reduce, but they do hang around in the body for a long time, so you have to reduce very slowly, or reduce or transfer to a much longer acting, slower acting one. So humans will always seek rewards, and chemicals can always cause harm to self and others. Now, I don't want to take David Nutt's story away from him, but you may be aware that the Lancet 2007, that David and a lot of his colleagues looked at the harm from different drugs. They looked at the harm caused by that. The physical harm from a drug to the person, the dependence, and also the social damage that's caused. I did see a lovely cartoon which I can't find, was it? If all the world smoked a big joint, there'd be peace for 2 hours in the world. The thought was quite, not recommending it, but you get the idea that perhaps somebody who smokes cannabis isn't then going to go out and commit a crime. They're just going to giggle about it. And these were the harms caused by substances based on those 3 criteria. Now the interesting thing was that actually heroin, cocaine, and methadone, but alcohol comes in at number 5. And if you look at actually, as was mentioned earlier, ecstasy and cannabis and those types of things, they are not causing as much harm. And these drugs in this colour are the Class A drugs, and other things which are not classed at all, like alcohol, for instance. So the legislation is not matching the harm caused by those substances. So some of those treatments can help people by reducing their risk or come off drugs, but as was already mentioned, there are always other problems that need to be dealt with. And finally, just to point you, there is the Choice of Medication website. The Trust has a portal for it. It's got over 160 drugs in there. Those are the ones that are used in substance misuse. There's 30 questions and answers on each drug. There are also separate sections on alcohol and opiate dependence and withdrawal. There's loads of stuff on there, plus loads of leaflets. And there are things like ways of comparing different substances, so that's opiate dependence, the different drugs, how they can be used. And that's one for alcohol dependence. There's one for alcohol withdrawal and one for opiate withdrawal as well. And there's loads of leaflets as well which you can look at. So they're all there. Free access, just go to the Trust website. Right, thank you very much.